you know exactly what you should be doing right now. Not tomorrow, not after this video, right now. You know you should be working out. You know you should be reading. You know you should be building that thing you keep telling yourself you'll start. You know you should be sleeping earlier, eating better, calling that person back, finishing that project that's been sitting half done on your desktop for 3 weeks. You know all of it. And yet, here you are. This isn't about motivation. You have plenty of that. In your head, at least. You've watched the videos, read the quotes, had the 2 a.m. conversations with yourself where you mapped out exactly who you're going to become, starting Monday. You felt it. That fire. That absolute certainty that this time is different. And then Monday came. Here's what nobody tells you. The problem isn't that you don't know what to do. The problem is that knowing and doing are run by completely different systems in your brain. And until you understand how those two systems work, and more importantly, why they constantly betray each other, you will keep living in that gap. That exhausting, identity-crushing gap between who you are in your head and who you actually are at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday. Today, we're closing that gap. This isn't motivation. This isn't a list of tips. This is a complete explanation of why your brain keeps doing this to you, and a 5-step system to make it stop. Stay with me until step 4. That one is the reason everything else fails. Most people never figure it out. The ones who do, they're the ones who actually change. Let's get into it. Before we do, I want to ask you something. How long have you been living in this gap? A year? 5 years? Drop it in the comments. Not because it's therapy, because I genuinely want to know how long this particular form of self-betrayal has been running in the background of your life. Comment below. Here's what's actually happening inside your brain, and why it's not your fault, but also completely your responsibility. Your brain has 2 systems that matter here. The first is your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that plans, reasons, sets goals, imagines futures, and knows with absolute clarity that going to the gym at 6 a.m. is a good idea. This is the part that fires up at 2 a.m. and writes the plan. Smart, articulate, visionary. This is the part of you that knows. The second system is your basal ganglia and limbic system. Older, faster, and infinitely more powerful in the moment. This system doesn't care about your 5-year plan. It cares about right now. It runs on habits, cues, rewards, and the avoidance of discomfort. It doesn't speak in logic, it speaks in impulse. And when 6 a.m. actually arrives, this is the system in charge. This is why you know and don't do. Your planning brain and your acting brain are not the same brain. They don't communicate as well as you think, and in any given moment of real decision, when the alarm goes off, when the blank document is open, when the choice is actually in front of you, your acting brain wins almost every time. Not because you're weak, because that's how the system is designed. Stanford neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky spent decades studying this exact split, the gap between intention and behavior, and his conclusion is both humbling and clarifying. Humans are the only species that can imagine a future self in vivid detail, and then completely fail to act in that self's interest. We are, in his words, the animal most capable of being betrayed by our own frontal lobe. You're not broken, you're just using the wrong operating system. So here's the system that actually works. 5 steps. Not 5 tips, 5 interlocking pieces that only function together. 1. The identity audit. Stop describing who you want to be. Here's something uncomfortable. Every time you say, I want to be more disciplined, or I'm going to start being consistent, you are accidentally telling your brain that discipline is a destination, somewhere you're going, not somewhere you are. And your brain, being the efficient pattern recognition machine it is, files that under future self, which is a polite way of saying, not now. The research on this is consistent and slightly devastating. A 2012 study published in the Journal of Consumer Research found that people who said, I don't do that, instead of I can't do that, were significantly more successful at maintaining behavior change. The language of identity, Who you are activates different neural pathways than the language of restriction, what you can or can't do. So the first step is not to add a new habit. It's to audit the story you're telling yourself about who you are. Write down, actually write, not think, 3 things you keep saying you want to become. Now rewrite each one as if it's already true. Not, I want to be someone who reads every day, but I am someone who reads every day. Not, I'm trying to be more consistent, but I'm consistent. Your brain doesn't know the difference between a story you tell it and a fact it observes. Give it the right story, and it starts looking for evidence to confirm it. That's not positive thinking. That's neuroscience. The irony, of course, is that most people skip this step because it feels too simple. They want the hack. They want the app. They want the 5-minute morning routine. And they completely bypass the one thing that would make all of those tools actually stick. 2. The minimum viable action. Shrink the target until your brain stops fighting. Your brain is not lazy, it is threat sensitive. And large, vague, ambitious tasks trigger the same stress response as actual danger. Your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for threat detection, genuinely cannot tell the difference between I need to run from a lion and I need to write this report. Both feel like survival situations. Both produce cortisol. Both make you want to do anything else. This is why you open your laptop to work and suddenly find yourself reorganizing your desktop icons with the focused intensity of a neurosurgeon. The solution is not to push through the resistance. The solution is to make the task so small that your amygdala doesn't even notice it. BJ Fogg at Stanford, who has spent 20 years studying behavior change, calls this the minimum viable behavior. Not the ideal version of the action, the smallest possible version that still counts. Don't go to the gym. Put on your workout clothes. That's it. The action is putting on the clothes. Don't write the report. Open the document and write 1 sentence. That's the action. Don't read for 30 minutes. Pick up the book, 1 page, done. This sounds insultingly simple. It is. And it works for a reason that your ambitious brain finds slightly offensive. Once you start, the brain releases dopamine, and dopamine creates momentum. The minimum viable action is not the goal, it's the trigger that bypasses the threat response and gets the system running. Most people set goals for their disciplined self. You need to set entry points for your resistant self. The disciplined self will show up once you've already started. It never shows up before. 4. The execution trigger. The step nobody talks about. This is the one. This is why I told you not to leave before step 4. You've identified who you are, you've shrunk the action, you've designed the environment, and you will still, on some days, stand in front of the open gym door and not walk in. You will still sit at the desk with the document open and not write the sentence. Because there is one more gap. The smallest and most treacherous gap of all, between intention and the first physical movement. Psychologist Peter Gallwitzer at New York University spent decades studying this specific gap and discovered something that changed how behavioral scientists think about habit formation. He found that people who formed what he called implementation intentions, specific if-then plans that linked a cue to an action, were dramatically more likely to follow through than people who simply intended to do the thing. Not, I'll work out tomorrow. But, when I pour my morning coffee, I will put on my workout clothes. Not, I'll read more. But, when I sit on the couch after dinner, I will pick up my book instead of my phone. The trigger is not the action. The trigger is the cue that makes the action automatic. Here's why this works at a neurological level. Your basal ganglia, remember, the part of the brain that actually runs your behavior, learns through repetition of cue, routine, reward loops. Every time you link a specific cue to a specific action and complete the loop, the pathway gets slightly more automatic. After enough repetitions, the cue itself produces the impulse to act. You stop deciding. You just do. This is the mechanism behind every habit you already have, good and bad. You don't decide to check your phone when you're bored. The feeling of boredom triggers the reach before you've consciously thought about it. You don't decide to make coffee in the morning. The alarm triggers the sequence. You are already running on triggers. The question is whether you designed them or whether they designed themselves. Pick one behavior you keep failing at. Write this sentence. When, specific cue, I will, minimum viable action. Put it somewhere you'll see it, not as motivation, as a neural programming instruction. 5. The identity confirmation loop. How you lock it in. Everything so far has been about getting you to act. This last step is about making sure the action compounds. Here's the problem most people run into. They have a good day, they follow through, they feel good. And then they wake up the next morning and the whole internal negotiation starts again, as if yesterday didn't happen. The streak doesn't feel real, the identity doesn't feel earned, and eventually, one missed day collapses everything. This happens because they never closed the loop. James Clear, who spent years synthesizing behavioral research into practical frameworks, identified what he calls identity-based habit formation. The idea is simple and profound. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you want to become. But your brain only counts the votes it's aware of. If you don't consciously acknowledge the vote, the tally doesn't update. So the final step is a 2-second ritual at the end of any completed action. Not a journal, not a reflection, 2 seconds. You look at what you just did and you say, out loud or silently, that's who I am. You finished the workout. That's who I am. You read the 10 pages. That's who I am. You wrote the sentence. That's who I am. This is not affirmation culture. This is neural bookkeeping. You are giving your brain the evidence it needs to update its model of who you are. And every time it updates, the next action becomes slightly less effortful because you're no longer trying to become someone. You're just being consistent with who you already are. The gap between knowing and doing is not a character flaw, it is a systems failure. And like any systems failure, it has a systems solution. You know what to do. You've always known. The question was never about the knowledge. The question was about the architecture. The invisible structure of identity, environment, triggers, and confirmation that either bridges the gap or leaves you standing on the wrong side of it indefinitely. 5 steps, 1 system. The identity audit that changes what your brain is looking for. The minimum viable action that gets past the threat response. The environment architecture that stops outsourcing your behavior to willpower. The execution trigger that automates the first movement. And the identity confirmation loop that locks in every single win. You're not someone who knows but doesn't do. That was a story. This is a different one. If this landed, you already know what to do. Subscribe if you want more of this. No pressure. You know where to find it.